The drop pod shuddered violently as it pierced the atmosphere of Firaxa 9, its reinforced hull glowing orange with friction. Inside, Jonas Reeve sat quietly with his knees tucked up and his eyes half closed, breathing slowly through his nose. While most cadets would be tense or murmuring last-minute tactics into their communicators, he was calm, eerily calm. Not because he wasn't aware of the stakes, but because he had been in chaos before. And this, by comparison, was methodical, predictable, almost peaceful. The screen above the hatch blinked green, signaling proximity to ground. Jonas straightened, flexing his fingers and checking his gear once more. He didn't carry anything fancy, just a standard-issue survival pack, thermal blanket, folding knife, 3 meters of wire, a striker, a ration bar, and a crude water filter, the same as everyone else. But what he carried inside his head, that wasn't standard at all. With a final hiss, the pod's bottom released and dropped him like a coin from the sky. He landed feet first, knees bent, rolling into the jungle floor with practiced ease. The scent hit him instantly, sharp, humid, with notes of resin, moss, and something acidic. Vines curled down from towering trees, and the undergrowth pulsed faintly in the heat. Firaxa 9 was alive, and it made no effort to hide it. He stood slowly and surveyed the terrain. The area was dense but not impassable. The trees were twisted and tall, their trunks wide enough to shelter 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Some bled sap the color of rust. Small creatures scurried from branch to branch, watching him with intelligent eyes, but none dared to approach. Jonas didn't rush. He crouched and touched the soil, rubbing it between his fingers. It was rich, slightly damp, with a scent that reminded him of early mornings in the Appalachian woods. Back when his grandfather would take him out with nothing but a blanket and a flint. "We don't beat nature, boy," the old man had said. "We make her curious about us." The thought made him smile. Around the jungle, other drop pods hissed open in the distance. Shrill alien voices echoed through the trees as cadets from every known species began shouting instructions and unpacking tools. One voice barked out in rhythmic clicks, probably a Zarnan. Another growled low and slow, maybe a Krug. Everyone would be scrambling to find the highest ground, the most defensible positions, the clearest sight lines. It was the textbook approach. But Jonas wasn't here to follow the textbook. He was here to survive his way. He turned slowly in a circle, scanning with all senses. No wind, just sticky heat. No open water, but he could smell dampness to the southeast. Good. The sun, or what passed for a sun here, was a dull gold, casting shifting shadows through the jungle canopy. The spot he landed in wasn't ideal for defense, but it was sheltered, quiet, and surprisingly flat. That was enough for him. Dropping his pack beside a low-hanging branch, he rolled up his sleeves and went to work. No scanning devices, no perimeter alarms, just observation and memory. The trees bore large leaves that looked tough and fibrous, possible use for shelter layering. Some vines were dry and cracking, but others were elastic and strong, perfect for binding. He found bark that peeled in wide sheets and noted how some insects clustered beneath, a possible protein source if it came to that. While other cadets likely began hammering out shelters or charging up energy shields, Jonas was walking slowly in widening circles, mentally mapping every tree, root, and burrow. He took note of which way the ants moved, which branches bore fruit, and where animal trails crossed the soil. He noticed a broken tree limb that had fallen and exposed a hollow core. It could serve as emergency storage or kindling stockpile. He dragged it toward his pack without a word. Faint tremors rumbled beneath his boots, not threatening, but rhythmic. Firaxa 9 had tectonic breathing. That meant heat would rise from the ground at night. Another detail stored away. An hour passed before he unpacked his knife, and even then he used it sparingly, stripping bark, trimming small limbs, weaving together a simple A-frame support using forked branches and vines. The structure rose gradually, not tall but broad, open to airflow and shaded by thick natural canopy. He reinforced the corners with buried stakes and covered the roof with overlapping layers of fan-like leaves, each one angled slightly to let water run off. By the time he was done, it didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a hiker's rest stop, something built with the land, not against it. Birds resumed chirping near his site, and the local insects didn't swarm him like the other cadets had feared. That meant he had found a neutral zone, not marked as predator territory nor nesting ground. He didn't call it a shelter. He called it base. The sun dipped lower. Distant cries from other zones suggested someone had already run into local wildlife. A shriek followed by static, a failed comm. Jonas didn't flinch. He sat on the log he had dragged earlier, watching as light filtered through the leaves in dancing patterns. He pulled a strip of bark from his pocket and began carving symbols into it with the tip of his knife. Not Earth language, just simple marks, locations, notes, reminders. He didn't need walls to feel safe. He needed understanding. That had always been the difference. A sudden gust carried in voices. Insectoid clicking again, harsh and panicked. Jonas turned his head and saw a group of Czarnan cadets racing across the ridge, lugging pieces of a snapped dome structure. One of them tripped, slammed into a root, and cursed. Another hissed at him for slowing the group. Jonas simply watched. And when one of the cadets glanced down and locked eyes with him, sitting calmly on a log beside a finished shelter, he didn't gloat. He just nodded, then looked back at the carving in his hand. A few minutes later, he murmured to himself, "Feels like camping with Grandpa." Night would fall soon. Firaxa's moons, 3 of them, would rise. The air would grow heavier, and the forest would change its tune. But Jonas was already home, not the kind with walls or screens, the kind built from instinct, memory, and a deep respect for everything that breathed, even the things that could kill him. Morning on Firaxa 9 began not with sunlight, but with vibration. Jonas awoke before the yellow glow breached the horizon, roused instead by the subtle quiver of roots beneath his shelter and the shift in insect hum. The jungle came alive not gradually, but with a sudden intensity. Calls from unseen creatures echoed from the canopy like distant drums, and mist clung low to the ground, blurring the line between earth and air. He stretched beneath his lean-to, pushing aside the thermal wrap he had used overnight. The warmth from the ground had risen just as he predicted, keeping him comfortable through the night despite the sharp drop in temperature. His shelter had held, dry and unmoved by the night winds, and now it stood quietly amid the awakening jungle, humble but steady. Jonas took his time with the morning. He didn't rush to patrol or scan, nor did he contact the Academy's Overwatch system. He crouched near a mossy patch, brushing dew into his filter and filling his collapsible cup with clean water. A few yards away, a spiny, 6-legged rodent sniffed the air warily before retreating into the brush. Jonas watched it go, nodding once as if greeting an old neighbor. Once hydrated, he turned to something no other cadet had likely even considered: comfort. He rummaged through his pack and withdrew the wire coil and one of the tougher vines he had harvested the evening before. Using his knife, he shaved smooth 2 long sticks and bent them into curved arcs, tying them together at crossing points. The result was crude but stable: the frame of a chair. He layered strips of bark over the seat and back, binding them with tensioned vine until the whole thing flexed slightly under pressure. He set it beside his lean-to and sat, testing the give. It creaked, but held. He leaned back and let out a long sigh. He wasn't lounging for the sake of rest. He was observing. From that low, relaxed position, his eyes could scan the treetops, his ears could track the movements of birds and insects, and he could feel the slight change in breeze against his skin. Everything meant something out here. But even that wasn't enough. Jonas wanted more than stability. He wanted sustainability. He stood again and walked the perimeter of his clearing until he found a fallen branch that forked at the end. He tested the wood for rot, then cut away the excess to leave a Y-shaped post. He planted it in the dirt and placed a long, hollow log across the top, leaving one end open. He gathered stones, building a crude fire pit below the log's belly, then stacked flat stones on one side to hold heat. It was the beginning of a smoker, something his grandfather had once built to dry fish in the forest. Here, it would let him preserve food beyond the daily ration bar. Not that he planned to kill anything unless needed, but preparation was its own kind of survival. He kindled the fire carefully, feeding it dried moss and curled bark until smoke curled lazily from the hollow log. The aroma rose sweet and earthy, attracting a curious beetle the size of his thumb. He watched it flutter, then waved it away gently. An hour passed in this rhythm, checking, shaping, improving, and eventually a shadow moved near the edge of the clearing. He didn't look up immediately, but the guttural tone that followed made him smirk. "You build furniture now, Earthling?" Jonas turned to see a Krug cadet standing with arms crossed, armor smeared with sap and dust. The Krug's triangular jaw flexed, his tone equal parts disbelief and contempt. Jonas stood slowly and wiped his hands on his pants. "I prefer not to sit in the mud," he said simply. The Krug grunted and stalked off without another word, muttering something in his native tongue that Jonas couldn't translate, but the tone was universal. Mockery. He didn't take it personally. No one here expected much from humans. Earth had only recently joined the interstellar community, and humans weren't genetically modified or armored like the other species. But that was fine. Let them underestimate him. Let them build bunkers and barricades while he built a life. By midday, Jonas had scavenged another stack of bark panels, large, flat pieces from a tree whose outer layer shed naturally in dry sheets. He sorted them carefully, choosing the ones with the least curl and carving into them with the edge of his blade. Not words, not yet, but symbols, pictures. He etched a jagged line to mark the stream bed to the south, a curl to represent the tree with the sweet-smelling leaves, a slanted oval where he'd seen bird nests. Each panel became a record of the terrain. He wedged the panels upright in a loose arc behind his chair, forming a primitive wall of memory. Anyone passing through would see what he had seen, not just where things were, but what they meant. By the time the sun reached its peak, sweat clung to his shirt and his fingers were stained with sap. He paused only when his stomach growled, tearing off a strip of ration bar and chewing slowly as he scanned the jungle again. His smoker still puffed gentle clouds into the air, and his shelter cast a long shadow that cooled the clearing. Then came another voice, high-pitched and clicking. "You should conserve energy. The second night is harder." Jonas looked up to see a Zarnan female perched on a tree limb, her segmented limbs clutching the bark. Her compound eyes shimmered, and her mandibles twitched as she observed his construction. He stood, adjusted his shirt, and gestured to the chair. "You want to sit and explain that?" She tilted her head, puzzled. "Sit?" "Try it," he said, stepping back. Cautiously, she dropped from the tree, landed silently, and approached the chair like it might bite. She lowered herself into it with slow calculation, bracing her limbs. When the structure held and shifted slightly under her weight, she froze. Then she leaned back experimentally and clicked softly in surprise. "It moves. It flexes with your weight," Jonas said. "Takes the stress off your frame." She sat in silence for a moment, then glanced at the bark slabs behind her. "This is unnecessary." "Survival isn't about doing the minimum," Jonas replied. "It's about doing enough to want to keep surviving." She didn't answer, but she stayed there for several minutes before standing, brushing her hands over the bark and climbing back into the trees without another word. Jonas didn't need validation. The jungle had already validated him by not killing him. But still, it made him grin. Slowly, quietly, his little patch of land was becoming something different. Not just a shelter, a place worth returning to. He fetched another panel and began carving again. This one would not be a map. It would be a story. The first day, the first visitor, the first words shared across species. He didn't know who would read it. Maybe no one. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that the jungle no longer felt like a test. It felt like a challenge he was choosing to meet on his own terms, with hands, heart, and history. And by the look of things, the jungle was starting to listen. The second night fell faster than expected. Firaxa-9's triple moons rose in an uneven arc, casting jagged shadows through the jungle as the temperature plummeted. The sounds of daytime gave way to something deeper, a throatier, more primal chorus that echoed from the underbrush. The canopy hissed with distant screeches, and something large let out a throaty bellow far to the west. But Jonas didn't stir from his seat. He sat beside his slowly dying fire, wrapped in his thermal layer, the soft glow from the embers flickering across his face. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, brushing dust from another piece of bark. He carved carefully by firelight now, the lines slower, more deliberate, more poetic. This wasn't a map or a note. This was a record. He was shaping the story of his survival, one line at a time. Earlier that day, he had noticed a curious behavior among the local insects. A cluster of them emerged every few hours in perfect formation, circling a rotting log before vanishing into the soil again. The movement had repeated with mathematical precision, and it fascinated him. So he carved that pattern into a slab, adding his own speculation beneath it. Possible hive vent. Avoid interference. Watch for rhythmic cycles. He wedged that panel beside his chair, tilting it forward like a lectern. Jonas had not planned to make a library. It had grown without intent, like vines curling toward sunlight. But now, with 10 panels arranged in a crescent arc, each bearing marks, theories, or patterns, it had become something undeniable. A repository of experience, a physical memory of his time in the jungle. The wind brushed across the panels, causing one to flutter and fall. He leaned forward, retrieved it, and pressed it back into place. He didn't hear the footsteps at first, too focused on etching a curl into the next slab. But then a branch snapped, sharp and purposeful. Jonas looked up slowly. A tall, lean figure stood just beyond the fire's edge, the glow reflecting off amber skin and a long cloak of moss-colored fibers. It was a Varnathi, humanoid, but with elongated features and near-luminescent eyes. The Varnathi cadet stood still, arms crossed, his gaze flicking from the fire to the bark panels. "You write stories in the dirt?" the cadet asked, voice slow and smooth like flowing water. Jonas tilted his head slightly. "I write what matters." The Varnathi approached, his boots silent against the soft ground. He circled the outer edge of the clearing, moving like a ghost, then stopped in front of the carved panels. His eyes scanned the markings without blinking. "You use no translation glyphs," he noted. "They're not for machines," Jonas said. "They're for anyone willing to pay attention." The cadet crouched, brushing 2 fingers along one of the carvings, the one with the zigzag pattern denoting predator tracks. He stared for a long moment, then spoke again, quieter this time. "My mentor used to say memory was sacred only when shared. You're sharing." Jonas said nothing. He simply continued carving, not as a dismissal, but as invitation. The Varnathi remained crouched for several more minutes before standing again. "I will return," he said, stepping backward into the trees. "Do not burn them." "I don't burn knowledge," Jonas replied. After the cadet vanished, Jonas sat back and sighed. The jungle felt different now, not safer, not quieter, but more attentive, as if it recognized something forming within its chaos. He ran his fingers across his latest panel, tracing the curve of an insect wing, then flipped the bark over and began a new story. He came at dusk, eyes like glass. "Spoke like the river. Morning brought the fog again, this time heavier, laced with pollen-like mist that glittered faintly in the low light. Jonas moved slowly, his joints stiff from the chill, but his mind already turning. He started collecting flatter stones from a dry stream bed nearby, laying them in a semicircle beneath his carved panels. It gave the area structure, not just a camp, but a reading space. He wasn't alone for long. A series of small clicks echoed from the treetops. He looked up and spotted the Zarnan female from before, now crouched on a branch with two others beside her. They didn't speak. Instead, one of them dropped lightly to the ground and approached the chair. He stood there awkwardly, eyeing the seat. Jonas motioned toward it. "Go ahead." The cadet sat stiffly, arms wrapped around his legs, then looked toward the arc of bark panels. The other Zarnan cadet followed, taking position on a nearby rock, antennae twitching. Jonas said nothing. He simply resumed carving. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by birdsong and the occasional creak of wood. When the Zarnan female finally spoke, her voice was lower than before. "This is not shelter. This is ritual." Jonas shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just habit." She stepped closer, tapped one of the panels that showed a simple triangular mark, a symbol Jonas used for a natural shelter he had found half a click east. "This is useful," she said. "Then it's yours." Her eyes snapped toward him. "You give it freely?" "It cost me nothing, but it might save someone else." The three stood in silence for a few seconds longer, then turned and vanished into the mist. Jonas sat back in his chair, pressing the heel of his hand against his chest, where something warm flickered beneath the fatigue. A connection, fragile but real. By midday, others arrived, not in groups, but one at a time. A Krug male stomped into the clearing, looked at the chair, grunted, and sat on a nearby log. He said nothing but didn't leave. A Myros cadet, short and web-footed, crept in and touched the panels delicately, then traced the carvings with his claw tip. One Varnathi came and stood silently in the corner for nearly half an hour before bowing and retreating into the brush. Jonas didn't lead them. He didn't try to. He offered only a space, a quiet, strange place in the wild where comfort existed alongside survival, where something human, something warm and unarmored, had rooted itself in the hostile dirt of Firaxa 9. He added another slab to the wall. The jungle listens. So do the others. Maybe that's the secret, not to scream louder, but to speak softer. Later that evening, just before the light vanished completely, he lit his smoker again. This time, he added a handful of fragrant leaves that gave the smoke a sweet, calming scent. As the curls drifted upward into the canopy, he watched two bright eyes blinking from the dark. Another visitor, unsure whether to step forward or flee. He didn't call out. He didn't wave. He simply adjusted the second log beside the fire and patted it twice. After a long pause, the figure stepped into view. It was the Varnathi cadet again, holding a panel of bark of his own and a blade. "May I?" he asked. Jonas nodded, and together, without another word, they began carving stories into the dust. By the fourth morning on Firaxa 9, Jonas no longer marked time by the moons or the sun. He measured it instead by visitors. Each new presence brought subtle shifts to the clearing he had claimed. A scuffed footprint near the fire pit, a broken twig where someone had paused too long, or a new bark carving left behind, propped carefully against one of his own. The jungle hadn't grown safer, but it had grown quieter around his camp, as if the land itself had acknowledged the strange human ritual unfolding at its center, not with approval, but with interest. Life still moved with wild intent just beyond the perimeter, yet none of it breached the space Jonas had built. His smoke still rose in gentle spirals. His chair still stood beside the fire, and now, his once solitary bark library had grown to nearly 20 panels, fanning out behind him like the ribs of some primitive cathedral. He rose before dawn, collecting dew from the broad leaves around his shelter, sipping water slowly as the cool mist curled around his ankles. He stepped barefoot over the flattened dirt where footsteps had converged the night before. In the fading light, the Varanasi cadet had returned once more, this time with more bark, more questions, and fewer words. They had carved side by side, exchanging nods instead of explanations. It had been enough. Jonas pulled a fresh piece of bark from his stash and ran his fingers along the smooth underside. It would become the next page, but not yet. Something new stirred in the air, a different tension. He felt it before he saw it. By mid-morning, the first shift arrived. The Krug male, who had once sneered at his furniture, now dragged logs into the clearing without explanation. He positioned them across from Jonas's chair, then sat and grunted, clearly winded. Jonas said nothing, only nodded. The Krug began whittling, clumsily, with a jagged blade. His technique was rough, but focused. He wasn't here to socialize. He was here to build. By noon, a group of amphibian cadets approached from the south ridge. 3 in total, 2 Myros and 1 Slen, their skin slick and eyes blinking asynchronously. They approached with caution, huddled close, as if unsure if they were permitted to enter. Jonas gestured toward the logs and went back to stripping vine. The Myros female stepped forward and placed something beside his smoker, a flat stone etched with pictographs. Not his style, but detailed. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She moved off to a corner of the clearing where she and her companions began weaving reeds together, mimicking the lines of Jonas's chair. He watched in silence, a half-smile forming as one of the reeds snapped and startled the Slen, who leapt back with a squawk. But the cadet didn't flee. He picked up another stalk and resumed weaving. It was happening. They weren't just visiting anymore. They were replicating. The idea of comfort, alien to so many of them, had taken root, not because Jonas had lectured or insisted, but because he had demonstrated. Now others wanted not only to observe, but to participate, to possess a sliver of peace in the chaos. Later that day, as Jonas carved a memory of the Krug's first attempt at a stool, a wobbly, 2-legged monstrosity, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A small drone, marked with the insignia of the Intergalactic Vanguard Academy, hovered at the edge of the canopy. Silent. Watching. Jonas didn't acknowledge it. He knew surveillance drones monitored every cadet, recording performance, stress levels, and behavioral anomalies. But now, that glassy orb had something new to film. Not just one human's unorthodox survival, but a subtle cultural bleed spreading outward from a single quiet clearing. When the light dimmed and the jungle grew restless again, the Varanasi returned, this time not alone. A second cadet followed behind him, younger, with paler eyes and a thinner build. He hesitated near the edge, unsure. Jonas pointed to the open space beside the fire. The younger cadet stepped forward slowly and lowered himself onto the dirt. His mentor handed him a bark panel. Together, they began to carve. The elder worked with sweeping lines. The younger's lines were smaller, clustered, but detailed. Jonas set down his own knife and simply watched. He listened to the sound of fiber splitting beneath careful pressure. He listened to the jungle shifting in the background, less like a beast pacing and more like an audience leaning forward. As night fell, the library doubled in size. New carvings were propped up not only by Jonas but by others. One of the Myros cadets etched a catalog of edible fungi. The Slen added pictograms of insects he had tracked and avoided. The Krug's bark held only scratches, but the pattern repeated, clearly intentional. When the fire burned low and the clearing grew dim, Jonas added no new slabs. Instead, he lifted a round, flat stone and placed it in front of the arc of panels. He sat cross-legged before it and waited. The others followed. Without a word, cadets from 5 different species formed a rough circle. Some sat on logs, some on the ground, some on the crude seats they had fashioned from vines or mud. They watched the flames. Jonas lifted a bark slab and read aloud. His voice was low but steady, recounting not a myth or command, but a moment. His first day, the smell of the soil, the first carved symbol. He spoke plainly, but each word struck with weight. When he finished, he set the panel aside and gestured to the Myros female. She rose and spoke next, her voice strange and musical, describing how she had once feared quiet, how silence had always preceded violence on her homeworld. But here, the silence was different. Here, it felt like permission. Others followed. Not all spoke. Some simply tapped their carvings, offering them without words. One cadet remained silent the entire time, arms crossed, eyes flicking between the speakers like he was cataloging their weaknesses. But he stayed. Jonas ended the circle not with a speech, but with action. He reached into his pack and retrieved the last unmarked piece of bark. He broke it into equal strips and handed one to each cadet present. "You've survived," he said. "Now write why." One by one, they accepted. When dawn came, the clearing was no longer just a survival site. It was a crossroads, a classroom, a shrine. And in the Academy's high orbit, where instructors reviewed daily logs and behavioral metrics, one supervisor paused the footage, frowned, and muttered, "What is the human doing down there?" No one had an answer. But Firaxa 9 did. It answered with stillness, with peace, with the silence of an old forest watching something new grow from the dirt. By the final dawn of survival week on Firaxa 9, the jungle no longer felt like a threat to Jonas. It breathed with him, not against him. The vines no longer seemed poised to strangle, and the roots beneath his feet didn't feel like snares. They were fixtures of a living world that had simply asked to be understood, not conquered. The fog that rolled in before sunrise settled gently on the clearing, softening the ground, curling around bark panels, and soaking the soil that had been walked and shaped by dozens of different species, all drawn to the space Jonas had created without a blueprint, without a command, and without permission. He sat quietly by the fire, stirring the embers with a stick, listening to the low rustle of movement behind him. Cadets had begun to rise. Some murmured in their own tongues. Some moved silently, their hands already reaching for the tools they had fashioned. A Varnathi cadet balanced a flat slab of bark on his forearm, the edges still raw from last night's carving. A Slen female yawned, then crouched by the smoker to check on the contents. None of them looked to Jonas for direction, yet every action in the camp had begun with him. Today was evaluation day. Somewhere above the jungle, orbiting in a silent black cradle of satellites and control decks, instructors were watching. Jonas didn't need to be told that. He could feel the weight in the air. The rules were simple. After 7 days in the wild, each cadet would be extracted, their shelters scanned, their health assessed, their behavioral logs reviewed. The goal had never been comfort. It had been survival. But Jonas had done something that couldn't be measured in muscle scans or hydration charts. He had built a place worth surviving in. As the sun broke over the tree line, a sharp whine pierced the air. A hovercraft, sleek and black, descended through the mist and settled just beyond the perimeter. The buzzing wings of the jungle fell into silence. One by one, cadets emerged from their makeshift shelters, stepping out of tents, lean-tos, and strange cocoons. Many looked bruised, scraped, exhausted. A few limped. Some kept to themselves, holding on to the last dignity they had left. Jonas remained where he was, still seated, his boots resting near the fire. From the ship, 3 figures stepped out. All officers in formal Black Academy armor, their faces obscured by reflective helmets. One of them held a scanner, another a datapad. The third, the highest ranking, walked forward with confident precision and stopped just short of the camp's center. He looked at the curved arrangement of bark panels, the carved symbols, the shared stools and chairs, the still smoking pit, and then at Jonas. "Cadet Reeve," the officer said through his helmet speaker. "Explain this." Jonas stood slowly, brushing his palms together. "This," he said, motioning to the clearing, is what happened when we stopped surviving and started choosing how to live. The officer remained silent for a long moment. Behind him, the scanner operator began walking the perimeter, occasionally pausing to record readings. The datapad officer knelt near the smoker, inspecting the stones. Your task, the lead officer said finally, was to build a shelter. A personal shelter. Your performance is being reviewed based on individual resilience, not collective comfort. Jonas looked around at the cadets who had gathered behind him. The Krug male who had once mocked him now stood beside a Myros female, both of them clutching their own bark carvings. A Zarnan cadet held his own reed-woven seat. The Varnathi cadet stood tall, silent as ever, but closer to Jonas than anyone else. I did build a shelter, Jonas said, turning back to the officer. But surviving alone doesn't prove strength. It proves isolation. What I built showed that comfort, cooperation, and memory can grow from the same soil as fear. And that maybe survival doesn't mean anything if no one wants to stay alive once it's over. The officer didn't respond. He stepped forward and touched one of the bark slabs. He turned it slowly, examined the etched symbols, then looked back at Jonas. You took no command, he said. You made no announcement. I didn't need to, Jonas replied. I just made space. There was a long pause. Then, without another word, the officer turned and walked back toward the hovercraft. The scanner technician followed, holding up his device and tapping at it rapidly. The datapad officer lingered for a moment, then looked at Jonas. Your name, she said, is now logged under cultural influence. That hasn't happened before in a survival drill. Jonas gave a small smile. There's a first time for everything. The ship lifted into the air, vanishing between the tree canopies as silently as it came. Once it was gone, the camp fell quiet again, but not out of fear. The cadets remained in place, staring not at the sky, but at the clearing. Jonas stepped forward and picked up one last bark panel, blank and smooth. He placed it gently in the center of the circle and stepped back. One by one, the cadets began approaching. A Zarnan cadet knelt first, dragging the tip of his knife into the bark, then a Myros, then the Krug. Each added a line, a symbol, or a piece of the story. Not about how they had survived the jungle, but how they had found a reason to build something more than walls. By the time the Academy's next drop pod arrived, to transport them back to the training station, no one rushed to leave. Some were still writing, others were still carving. Jonas packed his gear slowly. He rolled up the thermal wrap, tucked his knife into his boot, and slung the half-empty pack over his shoulder. Before stepping away from the clearing, he turned back and looked at what had been left behind. A circle of stone, a crown of carved bark, and a fire pit still smoldering with the scent of sweet leaves. He didn't take the carvings with him. He left them there, exactly where they were, for the next person to find. Because survival might be mandatory, but living was a choice, and someone, somewhere, would need a place to sit.